Here in Africa, we are all equal. The better man will always outwit the inferior. His color does not matter. On November 25th, 1918, 2 weeks after the end of the First World War, German General Paul Emil von Lettow-Vorbeck surrendered his force of 1,500 men to the British Rhodesian Army in East Africa. He was the last commander to continue the fighting after the war had ended and all his peers had surrendered. Now this is the video I've been wanting to make for the longest time.
You know how long I've been waiting for this? Woo, I'm about to make a name for myself here.
I don't think you guys walk away from this.
You just make sure people know what happened here today.
But I felt I couldn't do it justice without talking about the misery Germany inflicted on its African colonies prior to the First World War. So check out my previous 2 videos before watching this one. You have greater context and understanding for what you're about to listen to. The way I see it, there's 2 types of guys. There's Roman Empire guys, and then there's World War guys. I obviously fall into the latter category. World War I has been my obsession for 7 years now, and it's the reason why I even started this channel in the first place. And now I think I'm ready to tie it off with this video. So, our main character, Paul Emil von Lettow-Vorbeck, another 19th century German with von in his name. If you had that in your name back then, it's the equivalent of being like 6 foot today. Coming from a military dynasty that existed all the way back to the 14th century, he's the only general to be considered undefeated in the field of battle in World War I. Which isn't true, he definitely lost battles, but I'll get into that later. His father was an officer in the Prussian army, and fought in the Franco-Prussian War, which resulted in the creation of the German Empire. Lettow-Vorbeck was born in Saarlouis, Germany, and attended boarding school, and then joined the cadet corps at Potsdam and Berlin-Lichterfeld. I think that's how you say that. It's a pretty crazy fucking name. Lichterfeld. Whatever. In his youth he joined a gang, and then sold drugs, got shot, and then came out with a mixtape, and robbed motherfuckers. Which is pretty cool, I guess. Not really. I don't know. But these antics would mirror what he would do in Africa years later. His gang would often emerge victorious because of von Lettow's natural leadership qualities. The man had street smarts and book smarts in the mean streets of Germany. Von Lettow feared but also revered his war veteran father, as well as the other great German commanders like Helmuth von Moltke the Elder and Otto von Bismarck. Von Lettow's first real army experience outside of military barracks would be in 1901 during the Boxer Rebellion. Also cleverly named because martial arts at the time was called Chinese boxing by Westerners. That's not racist at all. Many Chinese citizens wanted to expunge Western influence that was plaguing China at the time, including Christianity, which was eroding the traditional Chinese religious beliefs. Many Chinese at the time still worshipped the Chinese pantheon of gods, and many of these gods required human sacrifice, which the Boxers were more than happy to oblige. Which is fair, I mean, it's not a revolution if you're not chopping off some heads. Thousands of Christian and Western Chinese sympathizers were executed en masse in temples and altars. This caused a huge uproar among the Western powers, and a coalition between countries like Britain, the United States, Russia, Germany, Japan, France, Austria-Hungary, and Italy was formed to combat the Boxers. Now, the most likely reason for this unlikely alliance was simply business. The Boxers were also trying to rid China of Western corporations that operated in the region, which explains why all these countries that didn't trust each other agreed to form this coalition. It's all about protecting their investments. The Boxers were defeated, and von Lettow missed all that shit. He arrived too late, but there were still some fanatical elements of the Boxers who resisted the overall surrender of the rebellion, and this is where von Lettow thought he could make a name for himself.
Woo, I'm about to make a...
Shut the fuck up. Von Lettow was sent to smoke out a garrison of Boxers still operating after peace negotiations. He made quick work of them with his German soldiers, and the law was that they had to be executed, despite many surrendering. It's unclear how von Lettow felt about summary execution, but he probably didn't feel that bad about it, since it was his duty to carry out this order from his superiors, and men like von Lettow are slaves to duty. He didn't say much about his first battle other than, "It went well." His cool and calm demeanor overshadowed the only hint of agitation, that being his fierce cigarette addiction. The next engagement that von Lettow would receive is his involvement in the Herero genocide in Namibia, that I have previously discussed 2 videos ago. Now I have respect for some of the characteristics and tactics that von Lettow displayed through his military career, but I can't discuss him properly without acknowledging his involvement with the genocide of the Herero people. When von Trotha, the leader of the German army that was tasked with suppressing the Herero rebellion, surrounded the Hereros at Waterberg Plateau in the Namibian deserts, von Lettow was one of his subordinates and took part in the battle. This is why I felt that there had to be a prerequisite that had to be met before I could make this video. I didn't want to go off making a video about this man and not discuss in detail the lives that he helped destroy through his military orders. Despite the horrors of the Herero Wars, Von Lettow learned a lot from his time in the Namibian desert. He saw how the Herero were able to live off the land and continue their campaign of resistance through guerrilla tactics and sabotage, a lesson that would become invaluable to him in the First World War. Despite his opposition to the Herero people, he would respect them greatly and gathered as much knowledge as he could. In 1913, Von Lettow would be promoted to lieutenant colonel and was given command of the Schutztruppe. The Schutztruppe were mostly African natives that fought for the German Imperial Army, and they would be the bedrock of the German African operations in World War I. In April 1914, Von Lettow was sent to German East Africa, but he was sent via boat, and one of his traveling companions was an author named Karen Blixen, who he formed a lifelong friendship with, and probably, most likely, definitely smashed. I mean, just listen to his quote from her. "He belonged to the olden days. I had never met another German who has given me so strong an impression of what Imperial Germany was and stood for." I have the slightest fucking idea what any of that means, but it sounds to me like she got a lot of penis on that boat ride. So, at this point you know the drill. Franz Ferdinand is assassinated in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914. Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia on July 28, 1914. Germany declares war on Russia because Russia supports Serbia, and Germany and Austria-Hungary are boys, and Germany also declares war on France and Belgium, and Britain declares war on Germany because Britain protects Belgium, and we have World War I. Well, as we know, the major European powers had colonies in Asia, the Pacific, and of course Africa. Africa was carved up by the Europeans during the Scramble for Africa period of the mid to late 19th century. Britain and France had the most colonies in Africa, and Germany had a few of these being Togoland, Cameroon, German Southwest Africa, which is Namibia, and German East Africa, which is Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi. Now, the white governors of almost all the colonies, German, British, and French alike, all wanted to refrain from war. They felt the war was a European affair and had nothing to do with them. Governor Heinrich Schnee oversaw German East Africa, and he shared the same sentiment of anti-war. By today's standards, he would be considered a far-right extremist, but in 1914, he was a liberal. The task of colonizers is wide and diversified. The natives are ignorant, they must be instructed. They are indolent, they must be taught to work. They are unclean, they must be taught cleanliness. They are ill with all manners of distempers, they must be healed. They are savage, cruel, and superstitious. They must become peaceful and enlightened. They also have a right to demand they should be regarded as a means and not an end. This was considered very liberal at the time, and Schnee viewed pitting whites against blacks could ruin European prestige. Of course, none of this really mattered to the military command in Berlin, London, or Paris, who viewed the boundaries of war through allegiance and not regional position. Now this is where the story expands. Paul Lettow-Vorbeck, while he is the main character in my telling of the German East African campaign, he obviously isn't the only person of significance in this story. The saga of the SMS Konigsberg is wrapped up in the fighting that happens in East Africa. It literally appears in the story, disappears, and then reappears again, but it's so significant, I can't imagine not talking about it. British light cruisers began attacking German cruisers along the coast of East Africa, and one of these ships was of course the SMS Konigsberg. Built in 1905, it was the bodyguard ship to the Kaiser's yacht, but now it was assigned to patrol the East African coast. Captained by Max Loof, he would maneuver around British ships for the remainder of the summer. On September 19, 1914, Loof received intel while the Konigsberg was resupplying coal in the Rufiji Delta that the British Royal Navy Cape Squadron ordered their ships to find and destroy the Konigsberg, and that the British ship HMS Pegasus was in Zanzibar harbor. Loof decided to turn the tables on the British, and the hunters would become the hunted. The Konigsberg slipped into the southern end of Zanzibar from the Rufiji River and past the HMS Helmuth, which was on guard. Loof fired a few warning shots as the Konigsberg passed by. Once the Konigsberg was in range of the HMS Pegasus, it opened fire for 20 uninterrupted minutes. The Konigsberg's guns outranged the HMS Pegasus, and not one of its shells could hit the Konigsberg. The HMS Pegasus sustained 39 deaths, 55 wounded, and was completely sunk by the SMS Konigsberg. Loof victorious, he slipped back into the Rufiji Delta. He was an absolute badass. He completely turned the tables on the British and managed to use guerrilla hit-and-run tactics on water. Guerrilla tactics would be the leading strategy in Germany's playbook in East Africa. British naval prestige was absolutely violated by Max Loof and his light cruiser, the SMS Konigsberg, which on a personal level that makes me very happy. The British colonized a third of the world and enslaved millions, pillaging and looting entire countries like India, and then they think they can paint themselves as the heroes of history because they have nationalized healthcare and outlawed slavery in 1833, while simultaneously profiting off the southern slave-picked cotton from the American South and legally changing the diameters of slavery and indentured servitude to continue their sugarcane industry. I'm just playing Britain. I love you guys. Sherlock was a great show, up until the last season. What the fuck was I talking about again? Oh yeah, the Konigsberg. Winston Churchill, that Winston Churchill, who was First Lord of the Admiralty at the time, assembled a task force of 3 warships to hunt down the Konigsberg. HMS Chatham, the largest, HMS Dartmouth, and HMS Weymouth. Sidney Robert Drury Lowe, old Count Dracula looking ass, was in command of the Chatham and task force. Drury Lowe was unaware that his intelligence squad had picked up 2 clues about the location of the Konigsberg. A chart depicting the Rufiji Delta in detail had been secured by the British Navy from a German merchant ship. The ship had made a journey up the Rufiji with coal, food, and other supplies, and had returned empty upon leaving the Rufiji Delta. The second clue was a German reserve officer was captured in a hut on an island opposite the mouth of the Rufiji. He said he was sent from Dar es Salaam to man a signal post, but it was unclear who he was supposed to be signaling. His diary contained information about the Konigsberg and a town called Salale, but this town didn't appear on British maps. These clues were debated but with no urgency, as the cat and mouse game between Max Loof and Drury Lowe went quiet, but was still very much present. A so-called British informant brought information to Zanzibar saying the Konigsberg was seen in the harbour of Dar es Salaam. However, it's believed that von Lettow forged fake documents and sent them to Zanzibar. The documents stated that the Konigsberg was docked in Dar es Salaam harbor, and von Lettow knew Drury Lowe would come guns blazing. Dar es Salaam was a neutral city, and many of its citizens took the stance of Governor Schnee, who viewed the Great War as a European affair that had nothing to do with Africa and its colonies. Von Lettow believed a war between the powers of Europe in Europe meant a war in her colonies as well. If he could have the city attacked by the British Navy, public opinion would shift in favor to ending neutrality, and thus von Lettow would be given freer reign to operate, much to the dismay of Governor Schnee, who opposed von Lettow's pro-war views. This is the start of the rivalry between the two. Von Lettow would do whatever he wanted, and Schnee would act like a little bitch and cry about it. Drury Lowe arrived and gave the city 30 minutes to surrender, but opened fire in 20. Asshole! The white flag that was supposed to be over the city was missing, and it's believed that von Lettow had a hand in this. Again, asshole. The bombardment lasted for over an hour, destroying homes and killing innocent civilians. Dar es Salaam officials told the HMS Chatham the city couldn't dock warships, and British higher-ups determined that the Konigsberg was never in the shipyard for the exact same reason. Governor Schnee sent a letter to Berlin saying, "I again draw your attention to the fact that Dar es Salaam and Tenga are defenseless harbors, and their inhabitants have taken no warlike acts." Regardless, Berlin took the matter seriously and gave von Lettow the support and authority that he was looking for. Like I said before, Governor Schnee cried and von Lettow did what he wanted. The first real land battle of the war in East Africa would commence on November 2nd, 1914 in the main port town of Tanga. Von Lettow's spies told him about the long-awaited invasion by the British would be here. What follows is a conversation between Governor Schnee and von Lettow taken from Robert Goudy's book, African Kaiser. And I think this conversation really explains the different leadership and ideologies of the two leaders. Von Lettow read the Reuters dispatch he was handed to from Governor Schnee. "Good! I shall send word to my troops to stand by for orders." What orders? It is obvious what we must do. There is only one way we can help the fatherland win this war, and this is by pinning down British soldiers here in Africa, and do that best by attacking them where they are most vulnerable. You actually want to attack the British? Of course, Your Excellence. And the obvious place to do this is in the north, in the vicinity of Kilimanjaro, where we share a frontier with British East Africa. Just on the other side is the Uganda Railway. If we cut it, Britain's supply line from the Mombasa coast to Nairobi and the interior will also be cut. Britain cannot afford to let that happen. She will react. Schnee was furious. You need to understand the situation clearly. I want no confusion in the coming days. I do not call you here tonight to hear what plans you have formulated or what orders you wish to give your troops. I call you here to receive my orders. I do not think it is within your power to give me orders, Your Excellence. I am responsible to the Supreme Commander of colonial troops at the Colonial Amt in Berlin. He is responsible to the High Command of the Army. Berlin is dead to us, Colonel. We are completely cut off. This is likely to be the case for some time. I remind you, as governor of this colony, I am commander-in-chief of the Schutztruppe, and you are under my orders. I have already worked out with my advisors what you will do. I have already made plans for the welfare and security of Dar es Salaam and the other ports. By midday tomorrow, I will order you and all your troops to leave Dar es Salaam. I repeat the word again, order. How can the evacuation of my troops possibly help the security of this city or the welfare of its citizens? What are your intentions? I am under no obligation to discuss my plans with you. You have your orders. I warn you that I intend to see that they are obeyed, even if that means relieving you of your command and putting you under arrest. Am I clear? I would like to ask again, Your Excellence, what are your intentions? What will you do about Dar es Salaam and the other ports? You have your orders. Do you obey them or not? If I'm to remove my troops from the city, I ask one thing, permission to remove them not only from Dar es Salaam, but all other coastal garrisons. I will reassemble them at Noimushi in the Kilimanjaro district. Permission refused, absolutely not. Noimushi is too close to the British frontier. Given the delicacy of our situation, the presence of troops at the border could be construed as a provocation, exactly the kind of provocation I wish to avoid. You will take your troops from Dar es Salaam inland, but keep them well away from the frontier. Understood? Understood. Von Lettow was about to walk out after saluting when Schnee said, Come back, Colonel. We will have a bit of schnapps before you go. Please understand that I am doing this because I am thinking about the welfare of the colony. And I am thinking about the welfare of the fatherland, Excellence. From this exchange, again, almost Churchill and Chamberlain vibe. Sort of. Schnee at all costs thought neutrality was achievable, but even despite Von Lettow's possible sabotage at Dar es Salaam, the British had their eyes on GEA, and they would take it by any means necessary regardless of public opinion. Tanga would be target number 1. Originally, the British wanted to attack both Dar es Salaam and Tanga simultaneously, but decided to focus their full efforts on Tanga and Longido, which was along the slopes of the mighty snow-capped Mount Kilimanjaro. Von Lettow, already receiving information about an attack on Tanga, was prepared for this. But Dar es Salaam also seemed like such an easy target, but of course being ordered to leave the city, he couldn't just leave a huge garrison there and expect Schnee to not wet his pants about it. Von Lettow decided to only defend Tanga, a massive gamble on his part, which paid off. If the British split their forces further, it's likely that Von Lettow wouldn't be remembered in the few history books written involving him. Now of course, this being Africa, I said before, white Europeans didn't like the idea of blacks and browns killing white men. The war in GEA is a great example of this coming to fruition. The British wouldn't send their white boys to fight black men on the coast of Africa. Instead, sailing on the Indian Ocean, they send the Indian troops, Indian Expeditionary Force B and C, B attacking Tanga with over 8,000 troops led by Richard Aikens, and C led by Brigadier J.M. Stewart, attacking Longido with 1,500 troops. This attack was repelled by the Germans, who only had about 700 Askaris, but still managed a W against the Indians. Tanga was the real prize, and it's really a battle that the British should have easily won. They outnumbered the Germans 8-1, and still lost. This is in large part due to British buffoonery and incompetence. Now Schnee sent a telegram to Von Lettow. You are forbidden to subject Tanga and the defenseless subjects of the town to the rigors of war. Even should the enemy land in force, there must be no resistance. Tanga must be saved from bombardment. Von Lettow wired back, to gain all, we must risk all, and continued to plan for the defense of Tanga. British Captain F.W. Caulfield on the HMS Fox arrived at Tanga ahead of his convoy on November 2nd, 1914. He wanted to honor the neutrality of Tanga set in place by Governor Schnee, and a German emissary went aboard the ship to speak with Captain Caulfield. Caulfield asked the emissary if there were mines in the harbor, and he lied and told him it was filled with mines, when in fact they didn't place fuck all in the harbor. The emissary asked for an hour to talk to his superiors about the surrender. Caulfield agreed, and the emissary went back to shore and joined the defense of the city, also sending Von Lettow a telegram about the situation. Caulfield waited for more than an hour with his tea and crumpets, thinking the Germans were going to surrender. Meanwhile, Von Lettow was just shoving troops into trains and sending them full speed to Tanga, ready to fucking murder the Indians. It's said that the Askar really enjoyed the train ride, as many had never seen or ridden a train before, and this added to their morale. Caulfield realized that he was fucking stupid and went back to join the rest of his convoy, but didn't even bother bombarding the city and instead just sent minesweepers, which of course found nothing. Now the man in charge of the whole invasion and commanding the Indian Expeditionary Force B was Richard Aikens, and both him and Caulfield were competing for the world's dumbest person award. Aikens was told that Askari under the Schutztruppe were some of the best trained soldiers in Africa, and he was offered Askari troops of his own who could give him an understanding of his enemy, the terrain, and how to manage the invasion. Aikens wasn't hearing any of this and believed the Schutztruppe were poorly trained and that he would have the whole war in Africa won by Christmas. Yeah, he was one of those ones. If you know anything about World War I generals, this was their favorite talking point for convincing Europe to go to war in 1914. Aikens' biggest mistake was not understanding his enemy, but simply disregard for his Indian troops because he was racist. He didn't give the Indians time to recover on shore from their long voyage across the Indian Ocean, and instead just had them attack as soon as they arrived. Also, he purposely or neglectfully let the British East African newspaper publish stories about an attack on Tanga. This attack was the worst kept secret in history. Now before I talk about the actual battle itself, there's one more character I must introduce. Richard Meinetzhagen, British intelligence officer in Africa, zoologist, bird lover, Zionist, pathological liar, and wife killer. Somehow, someway, this guy would insert himself into so many major events in World War I, like the Palestinian campaign and of course, the East African campaign. One day, Makai and his wife were alone in the woods, and she had found out about his various lies he had been spreading about his exploits, and she couldn't bear the fact that her husband was a liar, and she shot herself in the head, accidentally, while the two were alone. Or, it's believed that she threatened to expose him, and Makai went all Walter Frey on her and said, "I'll find another." Dude was a massive piece of shit, according to many sources. Now, he was present for the Battle of Tanga and had a lot to say about it, mostly racist remarks against the Indian soldiers actually fighting in the battle. The Indian Expeditionary Force attacked on the night of November 2nd, 1914, but many of their boats were stuck on reefs, exposing them to German machine gun fire. Another reason why Aiken should have taken some African troops to help him understand the terrain, but instead he decided to be racist. The cannons on the HMS Fox softened up the defenses, allowing the Indians to storm the beach. Many of the Indian troops were tightly packed onto the dark beach and weren't sure exactly where they were being fired from. Almost all the Indian troops were literally blindly shooting in the dark. The first wave of Indian soldiers outnumbered the Schutztruppe 4-1, but numbers take a backseat to resolve. The Indians were fighting on foreign soil in a conflict they didn't care for. The East Africans were fighting for their land, people, and their way of life, free from the influence of foreign conquest, even though they were already colonized. There are so many questions as to why the East Africans were so determined to fight for Germany in a conflict that didn't have much to do with them originally. I guess you can say the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know. Also, East Africans were being propagandized by German schools about the glory of Germany and how they were here to take care of the natives, whilst the British and French only had the destruction of the Africans as their goal. The last reason, and most likely, is just simply some men just want to fight. Regardless, that day the Africans far outmatched the Indians. The morning daylight of November 3rd revealed a grim sight for the Indian army. Many of them had their morale broken, they were wounded, and some were abandoning the battlefield. Richard Makai described the Indians as unfit for modern combat, and compared them to scurrying rabbits and monkeys. The Germans held their ground in the trenches and fortified positions and shot disorganized Indian troops to pieces. Many British officers would also be killed, adding to the confusion of the attacking force. Von Lettow heard of the success of the mostly Askari units defending Tanga, and more of his Schutztruppe squads were sent via the Usambara Railway to support the defense further. By November 4th, over 48 hours, an entire Schutztruppe army was transported to the Tanga battlefield, ready for a fight with high spirits. However, more Indian troops arrived off the shore and were supported by the naval cannons of the HMS Fox, thus making the East Africans outnumbered, now 8-1. Von Lettow knew he had to win this battle despite the odds being stacked against him. Heinrich Schnee still wanted to maintain neutrality of the colony, and Von Lettow still didn't have the authority to defend Tanga from the higher-ups. He could be court-martialed if he lost. Von Lettow would admit that the black non-commissioned officers, so sergeants, which was the highest rank a black soldier fighting for Germany could gain, were the backbone of the Schutztruppe. Without them, he would have lost. Richard Aikens made massive mistakes for the attack on November 4th. He didn't allow his naval cannons to soften up the Schutztruppe or allowed his artillery units to land on the beach to support the infantry. His lack of experience in fighting actual battles was beginning to show. He was a pencil pusher and a racist who underestimated the intelligence and resolve of Indian troops and African soldiers. His reasoning for not bombarding the city was that he didn't want to damage the city of Tanga, a pacifistic view like Schnee that cost him the battle. The Indians never stood a chance against the well-trained, well-commanded, determined Schutztruppe. Richard Makai observed the carnage from a distance and was shook to the core at what he was witnessing. A superior force being dismantled piece by piece by a completely small band of soldiers. I could not believe my eyes. It was demoralizing. We collected most of them, made them lay down and keep quiet, but they were gibbering and were not in it for any price. Individuals were shooting off their rifles in any direction, and many of the men were firing at our advancing troops. Nothing short of violence will stop this sort of thing. I had to use my boots and pistol to stop it. This is where Richard Makai leaves his post and heroically pits himself on the front lines with the Indian troops to lead a valiant attack against the Schutztruppe. He noticed two Indian troops fighting amongst each other in the battle as he tried to stop the fight. One of the soldiers drew their sword on him, and he said he shot the brute, and continued to lead the attack when a shell from the HMS Fox blew up beside him and sent him flying into a tree, but he was uninjured. This is the biggest cap I've ever seen since Native American headdresses. An intelligence officer has no business being on the front line. No one would ever allow this, and something like this would never happen on a battlefield, ever. His defense was that he did not know what to do at his post while the battle was happening. I guess he missed the part where he was supposed to be advising his generals and feeding them intel, basically his job. Like, what a loser, what the fuck is he even talking about? So, the Indian troops are advancing forward when suddenly massive clouds of bees swarm the Indians and Schutztruppe. This is where the Battle of Tanga would get its nickname, the Battle of Bees. This massively disoriented the fighting, but mostly on the British side. One troop was knocked out and then stung back to consciousness. It's believed that this was a secret weapon used by the German commander, where they had hidden caches of bees throughout the battlefield and then released them when the time was right. But this Looney Tunes ass plan is largely unconfirmed and unlikely, since they must have known that their own troops would be affected as well. But it is confirmed that the bees were at the battle, since many of the medical reports indicate that troops had to be treated for bee stings. One soldier had to have 300 stingers removed from his head. With many of the Indian troops falling to rifle, machine gun fire, and now killer bees, it looked as if the battle was over. But not yet. The elite Indian fighting force known as the Gurkhas had breached the city and removed the German flag and replaced it with the Union Jack. The fighting now spilled into the streets of Tanga. Aiken's subordinates pleaded with him to use the naval cannons and artillery from the HMS Fox on the town, and he finally agreed. But it was too late. He should have done this 2 days ago when the Indians weren't in the city and he didn't risk collateral damage. But now the battle lines were intertwined and many of his own troops were being hit by shell fire. One German hospital treating soldiers on both sides was destroyed by the artillery, killing many nurses, doctors, and wounded soldiers. This utter stupidity helped the Germans take the town back. On November 5th, the order was given to the Indians to retreat from the beaches and return to the ships. Von Lettow and the Schutztruppe had won. Before leaving, however, Richard Makai was invited to have breakfast with the Germans, and they discussed the battle like it was a soccer match. Makai, the blabbering buffoon that he was, discussed all the aspects of the battle, even telling the Germans that he would leave Tanga completely, and a counterattack would not commence. Von Lettow wasn't sure exactly if the British had one more attack left, but loudmouth Makai had snitched on the entire British army, and now Von Lettow knew that he was safe to declare victory. As Makai was leaving breakfast, he was carrying a white flag, and a fellow Indian soldier, who probably didn't know that a white flag meant surrender, shot at Makai, missing him. Makai then stabbed the Indian with the flagpole. Like I said, this man's a pathological liar. The whole story I just told you made no sense whatsoever. Von Lettow agreed to repatriate the abandoned Indian soldiers if they didn't take up arms against Germany for the duration of the war. 16 German soldiers were killed, along with 55 Askaris and over 75 troops wounded. Von Lettow also lost his best friend Tom von Prince, which weighed heavily on him for the rest of his life. Britain would lose 360 troops, with 150 missing in action and more than 480 troops wounded. The abandoned British equipment became a treasure trove for the German colonial army. Hundreds of rifles and ammunition, along with canned goods, clothing, all came in handy for future battles. This was one of the biggest failures in British military history. They outnumbered the Germans 8-1, but I guess they thought that wasn't fair for the Germans and decided to kill their own troops, thanks to the brilliance of Arthur Aikens and Richard Makai. Von Lettow had saved Tanga from the British, saved his career, proved Governor Schnee wrong, and was in the good graces of Berlin. The morale of the Schutztruppe was at an all-time high, and they were now more willing than ever to fight for Germany. So let's go back to the Konigsberg, now in the year 1915. Admiral Herbert King Hall, who called himself the ugliest man in the British Navy, which I believe, since even Wikipedia doesn't have a picture of his ugly ass, would share Drury Lowe's obsession with the Konigsberg, and the two were the main men appointed by Churchill to find the elusive German cruiser. Winston Churchill, always the meddler that he was, tried to micromanage every aspect of the hunt through wires and coded telegrams in London. Many times King Hall would fight Churchill on orders instructed to him. The first Sea Lord dictated, King Hall resisted. A battle of wills conducted over the ether from half a world away. Drury Lowe and King Hall knew that the Konigsberg was somewhere in the Rufiji Delta, but the delta was vast and very shallow, perfect for small boats and light cruisers, but the ships that the British were hunting with had deep hulls, and they couldn't just scour every corner of the Rufiji without the risk of damaging their own ships. So, King Hall decided that this search would have to be done on land from someone who knew the Rufiji very well. Peter J. Pretorius, South African-born, elephant hunter, and African frontier explorer, knew the Rufiji Delta. He considered it his backyard. PJ was the perfect man for the job, not only for his vast knowledge on the African wilderness, but also he had a serious beef with the Germans. He killed 47 tribesmen from an attacking war party in German East Africa. The German authorities threw him in jail for 2 years, but then released him after agreeing that he was acting in self-defense. While he was in prison, he learned German and developed a hatred for them. Out of all the languages to learn while you're pissed off, German does make the most sense. He said, "I'm convinced that no other race in the world would have acted as the authorities did in German East Africa. The German thinks that whatever the German does is proved right by his power to do it. He is the true law of the jungle, and knows no moral." German authorities had confiscated his farm previously. He built it as a gift to his wife, but shortly after moving in, she died of a fever. PJ had stopped elephant hunting when he married his wife, but after she died, he went back to it. He was illegally hunting elephants, and then the German authorities had cause to arrest him again. but PJ continued and only did so until the ivory gained from elephants was paid back in the value of his property. The Germans would chase him, always one step behind him, and the ivory stripped elephant carcasses he left behind. He would eventually make back what he lost in his property, and the German East African authorities ceased to look for him, despite being at the top of their most wanted list. In August 1914, PJ was in his PJs at his summer hunting camp on the Rovuma River when 200 Askaris appeared out of nowhere, led by a white German medical officer, and attacked his camp. He was shot in the leg by a rifle bullet but escaped, and for 4 months he was captured and escaped constantly from the Germans. His wound became infected and he took a knife and drove it into the infected area to release the pus. He was then found by natives and healed further. He would eventually try to enlist in the British Army, and he told his daring story of survival and defying the odds to the recruiting officers, but they thought he was full of more shit than Richard Mindshargen, which is interesting because both have dead wives that died from somewhat suspicious circumstances, and both have wild stories of heroism and bravery that come from a fucking ancient Greek epic than actual real life. They dismissed him as a German spy and sent him on his way. But 2 months later, while he was home, an officer told him to come with him to the police station to accept service into the Imperial British Army, and he accepted. King Hall knew much about PJ Pretorius because he was under British surveillance. The British discerned that he wasn't a German spy, and because of his deep hatred for the German, he could be weaponized against them. King Hall also knew about the tragedy of his wife and property, which he appealed to when speaking to PJ. When the two met each other, it was love at first sight, and Pretorius found him charming. The bushiest eyebrows I have ever seen. From the first, I instinctively liked him. Who the fuck likes someone because they have bushy eyebrows?
Fuck you! And your eyebrows!
King Hall told PJ that before he could assault the Konigsberg, he needed several pieces of intel. 1. Where was the Konigsberg? 2. Was she fit and capable? 3. Did her gun still work? 4. Did she still possess all her torpedoes, or had they been parceled out to torpedo launchers across the river where they might be fired at invading British craft? 5. Did a passage exist up the Simba-Oranga or Kukunya channels, the widest of the Rufiji's mouth, that might allow entry of a British warship with shallow draft? And 6. The British needed a tide chart to show low and high tides throughout the month. PJ had till spring to solve all these issues. The plan also required the use of airplanes and monitors. Monitors, no, not what you're watching this video on right now, were small ironclad warships that had their origins in the American Civil War, 50 years prior. They were maneuverable and perfect for the low draft in the shallow Rufiji Delta. They could also carry large artillery pieces used on the largest warships like dreadnoughts. The monitors that would be used in the assault were originally Brazilian, but once war broke out, the British stole them and took out all the beautiful brass and oak fittings and replaced them with an ugly ass grey interior. Brazil was an ally of the Entente during World War I, so I guess that's why the British thought that they could just bully Brazil and steal their allies' boats. PJ would set up his base of operations on Mafia Island, which would also have the first air station in German East Africa. 2 African locals were taken hostage at gunpoint by PJ and his men. He told the 2 Africans they would be paid 5 British pounds per month if they agreed to help him find the Konigsberg. They agreed, and they led PJ to a large tree and told him to climb. Once PJ was at the top, he scanned the Rufiji Delta with high-powered Navy binoculars, and for a few moments he saw only jungle. And then, finally he saw it. The Konigsberg was anchored in the Simba-Oranga channel, perfectly camouflaged to mimic the surrounding jungle. The man had found the Konigsberg on his first excursion into the Rufiji Delta. Captain Max Loof was recruiting temporary stokers for the Konigsberg furnaces, and PJ saw this as his opportunity to infiltrate the ship and retrieve the other pieces of vital intel he needed. One of the stokers was the son of the African who led PJ to the Konigsberg, and he was allowed visitors, which was a major lapse in security on Captain Max Loof's part. PJ had a dark complexion and knew Swahili, which helped in his ruse when he disguised himself as a Swahili Arabic trader to get onto the Konigsberg. Pretorius and the African made their way inside, and they had brought chickens along with them as gifts for the German Navymen. The African asked to see his son, and Pretorius began questioning him, disguising the questions with regular banter. "Were the ship's guns working?" "Yes," replied the stoker. He told PJ that the torpedoes were parceled out to riverboats. PJ had also noticed that the condition and morale of the crew was virtually non-existent. The men were sick with disease, malaria, and were not getting sufficient food. Now that the Q&A was over, PJ could move on to the next phase, which was crafting a tide chart for King Hall. He disguised himself as a fisherman and actually caught fish to support his disguise. He fixed his notch pole in the secluded part of the Simba-Oranga and measured the tides on the river while being surrounded by crocodiles and mosquitoes. And this is Africa we're talking about, so these motherfuckers are not the little potatoes you see in North America. These motherfuckers will suck you dry. Pause. The main channel averaged 6 to 7 feet deep, shallow enough to allow monitors to enter the area. After a month of measuring the tide, he had an accurate tide chart for King Hall. For his success, he was given a position as Chief of Scouts and was given the rank of Major. How accurate his story is, I'm honestly not sure. There's a hint of Mindshargen-esque bullshit wrapped up in PJ's story. Like, for example, the guy's name is PJ and was in his PJs when he was attacked. Like, that's not a joke I came up with. That came from the source I was reading. Or how coincidentally, the guy who led PJ to Konigsberg also had a son working as a stoker on the boat. Seems too convenient for me. But if I had to believe someone, I'm believing PJ Pretorius over Mindshargen, Schlagen, Blagen, Flaggen. Now that King Hall had all the information he needed, he was ready to send his newly arrived Sopwith airplanes to do a bombing run of the Konigsberg, the very first in history. But due to the sweltering conditions of East Africa, the Sopwiths malfunctioned. The propellers became unglued from the heat and spun into pieces, and the engine seized up just after a few hours in the air. However, King Hall sent seaplanes to do reconnaissance over the Konigsberg, but the pilot was shot at by the Germans and the engines almost blew up. But he was able to make a crash landing back at Mafia Island, and he was uninjured. The picture of the Konigsberg was the first picture taken of a battleship under siege. This laid the groundwork for aerial reconnaissance in the future. The Konigsberg crew were not able to receive vital supplies from Von Lettow due to the British blockade. There was an attempt to resupply the Konigsberg, but the British intercepted the ship sent on the resupply mission. At this point, Captain Luff wanted to escape, but the Konigsberg was rotting away as mold was growing everywhere on the ship. Communication was completely cut off and the Konigsberg was on its own. King Hall's monitors had arrived and the Battle of the Rufiji Delta was about to commence on July 6, 1915. German spotters saw the monitor chugging up and down the channel and Captain Luff was informed, but he didn't say shit to his crew as to not plunge the morale of the sailors further into the depths than it already was. The crew were having their delicious breakfast of porridge, hippo tongue, and cassava when the alarms rang and they rushed to their battle stations. In reality, they were just looking for any excuse to run away from the trash that they had to call breakfast. There was an officer on board who ended up shooting himself in the head, but botched it and died a most painful death. There are various theories among the crew as to why this officer did this. The theory that makes the most sense was simply he was a pencil pusher who couldn't handle the stress of war. Another theory was that he was a British spy who was the one who leaked the information of the whereabouts of the Konigsberg, and he was worried about being discovered, so he put a bullet in his head. Obviously, this is not true, since it was our boy PJ doing James Bond type shit in Africa. Pretorius watched nearby as the naval battle unfolded before him, as this was his first, and he was loving every second of it. He probably felt like a big man that day. All this was made possible by his excellent espionage work. The monitor's guns began firing at the Konigsberg, and one shell hit the kitchen, vaporizing the poor cook inside. There's never any love for the kitchen staff. The monitors would be fired on by spotters and artillerymen hiding in their trees behind the Konigsberg, and 2 British Navy men aboard the monitors would be killed. The monitors responded with an astounding 635 shells fired at the Konigsberg. Guess how many hit the target? 300, 200, 150, 80? No. 6! Only 6 shells hit the Konigsberg. They missed 629 fucking times. At that point, just quit and go home. Don't even say goodbye. Don't even take the boats. That is fucking pathetic. The Konigsberg managed to eliminate a third of the monitor's crew, and they couldn't even move. The monitors had full mobile capabilities, and they missed 629 times. So if you ever feel like a failure in life, just remember the almighty British Navy that invaded 90% of the countries in the world missed 629 times at a stationary fucking target. No one is that shit. The monitors retreated, but they would be back on July 11th with even more firepower to mess with. The barrage of July 11th from the British was ferocious, and it looked like the Konigsberg was about to become a giant piece of scrap metal. One of the monitors acted as a diversion while the other was trying to flank around to get closer to the Konigsberg. Probably a good idea since these guys have shooter aim than the stormtroopers from Star Wars. The plan worked and the Konigsberg took serious damage, and it was sunk, but the channel was so shallow that the ship was barely submerged, and it just tilted on one side. Captain Luff was severely injured, but still assumed command despite the damage done to him. When he realized they had lost the battle, he ordered the ship to be scuttled, so the British couldn't scavenge what remained. 33 crewmen were lost on the Konigsberg that day, and King Hall received news about the sinking of the Konigsberg, and responded with a message saying, "Well done, monitors." The German sailors would strip the Konigsberg before the British could arrive, and its largest guns were given to Von Lettow for the land campaign. The destruction of the light cruiser ended up working out in Von Lettow's favor, since now he was in control of some of the largest artillery pieces in Africa. The Battle of the Rufiji Delta was the longest naval engagement ever in history, at a whopping 252 days. King Hall was criticized for allowing the cost of the 252-day-long hunt for the Konigsberg to skyrocket. 38,000 tons of coal were used by the British to hunt the Konigsberg. He was also criticized for not using a more aggressive land strategy and meandering for too long instead of actively hunting the German ship, which I must agree with. He really did just let PJ Pretorius do all the work while he just waited for things to come to him. The Konigsberg would rust away in the Rufiji Delta for 50 years until, in the 60s, the remaining metal was removed and cut up. Only 50 members of the original crew of 155 lived to see Germany again, and for King Hall, this would be his last military engagement. Because he missed 629 fucking times. Back on land, von Lettow was rapidly becoming the best commander in the eyes of the Schutztruppe and public enemy number 1 to the British in Africa. He had commanded an attack on Yasin Fort, held by mostly Indian troops, which he won using a bullhead attack formation. I want to reiterate von Lettow's goals in East Africa, because otherwise it does seem like he was losing once the years of 1916 and 1917 come into play. But a decisive military victory was not what he was after. He was trying to divert vital much-needed ammunition, resources, and men from Europe and tie them down in Africa. He would later initiate a scorched earth policy that would cause a massive famine to the local innocent population. But in von Lettow's mind, the ends justified the means, as long as the British couldn't recover resources from or claim any of the villages. It was all worth it just as long as they chased him, which allowed him to dictate where the battles would be fought. Resources in any war are essential for feeding the war machine, and East Africa was no exception. Great Britain had cut off the supply trade to Germany East Africa, which meant von Lettow had to improvise. He convinced Governor Schneid to implement policies to increase war material production, but GEA lacked factories and warehouses like Europe. Some new ones were being built to make nails and ammunition, but von Lettow turned to many of the local population to build supplies for him, many of them using traditional East African techniques. Leather was stripped from buffalo to create boots, and rubber for tires being made from some white milky liquid that dripped from trees onto rope, and then it was kneaded into rubber. And they basically made tires from tree cum, okay? That's what was happening there. Now, all these supplies that were being produced sound great, but you need to be able to move it preferably by truck because railways are obviously more restrictive. But this is East Africa in the 1910s, which means there were only like 2 railways and a few roads in the entire country. Von Lettow would recruit 8,000 African natives in 1915 to carry supplies for the army, and this is where the bulk of the casualties would take place. Many would die from disease, exhaustion, and starvation. This was easily the cruelest aspect of the war in Africa, and it's unfortunate that so many innocent Africans were roped into such cruelty. But such is the way of modern wars. Innocent civilians always take the biggest casualties. Von Lettow was now ready for Britain's re-invasion of German East Africa, and now Britain was sending in someone unconventional who could turn the war in their favor. Jan Smuts was a South African rebel who fought against the British in the Boer War in 1899, but when the war was over, he was brought back into the fold in the British Army. Many officials didn't like the idea of a former rebel against the crown taking command in such a vital operation. When Smuts took command, he began cleaning house, and rightfully so. Idiots like Aikens, Caulfield, and Meinsargen, who fumbled the invasion of Tanga, were to be removed and replaced with competent individuals. He replaced General Tighe, who was head of most of the operations in Germany East Africa, with General Reginald Hoskins of the King's African Rifles, or KAR, which could be considered the British counterpart to the German Schutztruppe. Hoskins had experience leading black troops, which made him a good choice for Smuts. They also both agreed that black troops in Africa made better fighters than white soldiers, to their disappointment. Smuts would defeat the Germans in German Southwest Africa, winning the colony for the British. All the other former German African territories were defeated and taken over by Britain and France, and now only German East Africa remained, with von Lettow and his Schutztruppe defending the colony alone. Smuts would meet von Lettow on the battlefield with the same vigor and determination shared by his military rival and later friend. The first major engagement for Smuts was the Battle of Saleta Hill, near Mount Kilimanjaro on February 12, 1916. The guns from the sunken HMS Pegasus were used in the battle and bombarded the second-line trench system and not the first-line trench system due to faulty intelligence. The Germans returned artillery fire and the Schutztruppe repelled the Indian, Rhodesian, and South African army. Another W for von Lettow and Smuts' first L. Oh, and the battle saw the first use of armored cars by the British, and when the African soldiers saw them in the distance, they thought they were rhinos. I don't know if that's just some racist white historian writing that down and telling people that's what the Africans thought, but I thought it was an interesting piece of information regardless. Now, as the battle between Smuts and von Lettow continued through 1916, Smuts had to come to terms with 4 facts. One was that von Lettow was a much better commander than he was, even if he didn't want to admit it. Second, the Schutztruppe were much better soldiers than the KAR. Third, the disease-carrying worms and tsetse fly would claim the most casualties, attacking both horses and people. Rows and rows of dead horses would litter the African battlefields. Lastly, the rain. It rained like God had personal beef with Tanzania. Downpours would last 24 hours, turning the terrain into something that resembled no man's land in France. This made marches and maneuvering painfully difficult. Portugal would join World War I on the side of Britain on March 9, 1916, which meant Smuts had another army able to invade. He would attack the colony on all possible points of entry, thus causing the smaller Schutztruppe to split their army, which would give Smuts the numbers advantage. His soldiers had a skill issue, so he had to resort to numbers. Britain and Belgium would invade from Lake Tanganyika, which is one of the deepest lakes in the world and acted as a natural barrier and border for Germany East Africa. They would work their way through the Central Railway to take Tabora, which became the capital in 1916 and was the home of Governor Schnee. The Portuguese would invade through the Rovuma River in the south. The Usambara Railway north of the colony was also a point of attack for Smuts, and von Lettow had anticipated this. He set up defenses on Kehe Station, which ran along the railway. The flanks were blocked by 2 crocodile-infested rivers and machine guns pointing at Smuts' advance. At first, the Schutztruppe inflicted heavy casualties on the British, but through the night, the British pushed forward. Von Lettow would order retreat since he couldn't afford to waste troops to the superior numbers of the British army, even if he was able to inflict more casualties on them. Von Lettow left the British with nothing, however, and they didn't gain much from the battle. Smuts would move from Moshi to Morogoro, and this is where God would unleash his natural weapon of war, the rains. Smuts listened to former South African Boers who had moved from South Africa to Germany East Africa about the weather and terrain of GEA. It's unclear why he chose to listen to British rebels as opposed to his own loyal servants, but regardless, the Boers lied to him and told him to the south that the land didn't see much rain, which of course was a lie, which Smuts had accepted. Smuts marched his army through the deluge, taking massive losses from the elements, playing right into von Lettow's hand. This was one of the worst rainfalls in Tanzania in history. The former dry land had now turned into shallow lakes. I have never dreamed rain would fall as it does here. The rivers are full. The country is one vast swamp. Horses, mules, and men are suffering terribly from the climate. It is the constant unending damp, I think, that gets into men's stomachs and bowels that gives them dysentery. Von Lettow's plan was working. He had a better understanding of the terrain during the rainy season and listened to the sound advice of his native African subordinates. Smuts was getting advice from people who hated the British and ignored his subordinates. In April, British commander Jacob van Deventer had led his division to attack the lightly defended town of Kondoe-Erengi, held by the Germans, with what some historians call the greatest cavalry charge of the entire First World War. But then 2 months later, von Lettow attacked with 4,000 of the Schutztruppe against 3,000 of van Deventer's defending force and drove them out of the town. This was the first time the Germans had superior numbers in East Africa. Originally, 10,000 troops marched to Kondoe-Erengi, but due to disease and illness, only 3,000 were fit to fight. Now you see how fucked up the conditions for soldiers were during the rainy seasons. Smuts really should have waited a little longer for the rains to subside. He would have won the war much quicker and not caused the needless suffering from his troops from illness. Now, Van Deventer would hold out just a little longer for von Lettow to do his signature move, run the fuck away. Now initially, Van Deventer thought he did something and won the battle, but when he took a moment and looked at his losses, he realized he fucked up. He took 200 casualties, while the Germans only took 30. Also, Kondoe-Erengi was previously burnt down by the Germans when they first retreated. So for 2 months, Van Deventer's men were just occupying wet rubble, which added to the worsening conditions of his troops. So yeah, big win for von Lettow again. In August 1916, Smuts and Van Deventer advanced to Morogoro, one of their main objectives in the campaign. They knew von Lettow was at Morogoro, and they were hoping to finally capture him and end the war in Africa. But the British, always a step behind von Lettow, failed to seize the opportunity as he had already left, but was still observing the town from afar. As he noted, he saw his opponent Jan Smuts enter the town, and could have had him assassinated, but didn't, because he thought it was unsportsmanlike. Which really sums up how the commanders on both sides looked at the war in Africa. To them, they were unburdened by the horrors and evolution of the war in Europe, and so they could operate the war in a so-called traditional, gentlemanly manner. It's too bad almost 1 million Africans had to die for these white men to conduct their quote-unquote sport. The Schutztruppe had left the arriving British a nice little parting gift. They shit and piss all over the floors and walls of the town and said peace, and it was extra wet and smelly. They left under pressure, one officer joked. Von Lettow and the Schutztruppe were retreating to the southern Mahenge region, where food was plentiful and they could live off the land. He also had hidden stashes of weapons and ammo. Von Lettow expressed that he could continue the war indefinitely in that area. Schnee expressed bewilderment at such a plan and thought German East Africa should surrender. Schnee always had to be a pussy, and it gets even worse. Now that the German army was more concentrated on the south, Dar es Salaam was open for the British, and the Monitor Mercy, the same monitor that attacked the Konigsberg, was used in the assault. The German colonial authorities surrendered the city on September 3rd, 1916. After the fall of Dar es Salaam, the Belgians and British would invade from Lake Tanganyika, taking the lake and moving on to Tabora, the main objective of the entire campaign. Interesting semi-fact about the Belgian Congolese army. Britain offered 5,000 carriers to Belgium from Uganda, but the carriers deserted because they didn't want to be fucking eaten. Some of the Belgian Askaris were recruited from cannibalistic tribes, and it was rumored that when the Belgians were low on food for the Askaris, they would feed them prisoners. Governor Schnee had left Tabora before the arrival of the Belgians and British and joined von Lettow on the march down south, and once the two met up, Schnee complained the entire march, and von Lettow just rolled his eyes and continued with the march as Schnee was in his ear yapping like an irate ex-girlfriend about how they should surrender and the war is over and von Lettow doesn't treat him right, and this, that, and the third. Meanwhile, back at Tabora, the Germans defended the town with about 5,000 men. The Belgians attacked with a force of about 10,000 and wrestled the town from the Germans. The major objective was now in the hands of the Allied colonial powers. In a normal war, this would have ended things. All the major government and military points of interest were in the hands of the British, and so were the factories. But von Lettow was not waging a normal war, and he still had the resources to harass the British when he wanted. The guerrilla campaign that he was waging was far from over. By December 1916, Smuts wanted to end the war quickly, but the elusive nature of von Lettow was dragging on and costing the British Empire more than it was ultimately worth. Smuts thought poison gas, which was oddly absent in the African theater of the war, would be the solution to a quick victory. However, experts told him that the humid weather of Africa would make gas useless, and ultimately, Smuts didn't like poison gas being used in war, so this idea never saw daylight. On January 20th, 1917, Smuts would relinquish his command in Africa and head to London, but not before congratulating von Lettow on his medals that he had recently received from Berlin, the most important being the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military honor. May I hope that, though we are unfortunately compelled to oppose each other, an expression of my sincere congratulations on your richly deserved distinction may not be distasteful to you. The Kaiser would ultimately take von Lettow's side on the matter of who was the better leader of the colony during wartime. Kaiser Wilhelm II wholeheartedly supported von Lettow's defense of German East Africa for the 3 years against overwhelming odds and numbers stacked against him. This in total cheered von Lettow up, who was suffering from malaria for the 4th time. Smuts would leave command to his direct subordinate, General Hoskins, who was now under pressure to finish the war. Jan Smuts had told Parliament that he had taken all the major towns, roads, railways, and ports, and the only remaining element of the Schutztruppe remained in the south of Tanzania. Smuts thought that they would fall quickly. Hoskins, on the other hand, knew this war was far from over, and if Paul Emil von Lettow-Vorbeck continued to harass and elude the British, they were never truly victorious. Hoskins started revving up war material and food production surpassing what Smuts had produced when he was commanding. Many South African and Indian troops had been in the field for months without any resupply, and many of the men were starving and now living off whatever they could. There was one story where soldiers were so famished that they dug up a dead donkey that they had buried 2 days prior and ate it. Now, with Hoskins commanding, soldiers were able to carry 5.5 times more supplies in their kits than previously. But then the British had him reassigned to Mesopotamia and had him replaced with Jacob van Deventer, conqueror of the wet rubble at Kondoirengi. I guess Hoskins was spending too much money on Africans and Indians, and the British were like, shouldn't we be spending money on humans, not monkeys? He also admitted that the Africans made better soldiers than Europeans and Indians, which probably royally pissed off everyone. Van Deventer continued to push von Lettow further south, and problems for von Lettow began to emerge. The natives who lived here were largely unaffected by the war, but now it had come to their doorsteps. Von Lettow was stealing cows and food from the natives, causing local uprisings. PJ Pretorius, the elephant murderer and Konigsberg hunter, began coordinating uprisings to harass the Schutztruppe. The ghost was back. Funny enough, von Lettow would get this title amongst his men as the elusive nature to appear and disappear on a whim against the British started to become mythologized amongst the combatants of Africa. So, the ghosts of Africa had finally crossed paths. On October 17, 1917, the largest and bloodiest battle of German East Africa would be fought, called the Battle of Mahiwa. It was the closest thing in Africa that resembled the Western Front. Trenches, machine guns, mud, blood, and bayonets all played major roles in this battle. The Schutztruppe were on a ridge behind the dry bed of a small stream as the Indians and Nigerians were coming at them. The Schutztruppe held them off, and one of the Nigerian trenches had 3 German shells score direct hits on the trench. Some guy named Walter Downs, who was a first-hand witness of the carnage, had this to say about the crazy shit he saw. The trees above this trench were dripping blood for 2 days afterwards from limbs and trunks of men that had been blown up and been wedged between the branches. Poor guy was so traumatized, he did nothing but stare at a fucking tree for 2 days. Both sides suffered terrible losses, and even though von Lettow thought he won and called it a splendid victory, he took almost 600 casualties out of 1,500 engaged in combat. The British took 2,700 out of 4,900, practically half of their attacking force. The battle was in fact not splendid, and now even von Lettow knew that he had to reduce his army by losing some of their prisoners, women and politicians, hopefully Schnee, and travel on foot to Portuguese East Africa, Mozambique, to the south to continue his campaign of harassment. Upon von Lettow's march with his staff and army to Portuguese East Africa, he would leave behind 121 prisoners of war, some of whom were from the Battle of Tanga almost 3 years prior. Max Loof, the former captain of the Konigsberg, was also among those who chose to stay behind, which couldn't have made von Lettow any happier, except perhaps Schnee also staying behind with Loof. But Schnee remained healthy and stuck with von Lettow, much to his disappointment. Going into the final year of the war in 1918, the German army found Portuguese East Africa to be abundant in food, and the locals loved them, viewing them as liberators against their oppressive Portuguese overlords. The men stayed in makeshift camps, eating fresh bread and pork, and smoked fresh cigars, as they sat by the fire or relaxed in their hammocks. The fighting spirit and skill of the East African Portuguese army was also lacking, and because the land was so dense in jungle, it was the perfect place for von Lettow to wage his guerrilla hit-and-run tactics, a type of fighting that the opposition didn't have much experience in. The morale of the African Askaris during the start of the invasion was very high, and many historians and generals have noted how impressive it was that so many of the native troops held together their enthusiasm and determination to wage war. However, that changed when the British had authorization to operate in Portuguese East Africa and began dropping propaganda leaflets that said, "You all roam around in the bush like monkeys. What do you expect to gain from these Germans? Here there is sheer comfort waiting for you. As for food, you'll be given flour meal, rice, sugar, dates, meat, fish, and seasoning of every kind." See, that's how you know they're lying. Seasoning and British food? Get the fuck out of here. But somehow this worked. You think it was a line about blacks being monkeys that convinced them to abandon their campaign? Even still, von Lettow did have a force effective enough to run guerrilla operations against the Portuguese. A South African Boer scout had a pretty good quote when he was walking with von Lettow. "This is a queer war. We chase the Portuguese, and the English chase us." Yeah, I agree, that does sound pretty gay. After von Lettow's excursion in Portuguese East Africa, he would attempt to return to German East Africa, but then he knew that the British were waiting for him in great numbers, seeing as how now the colony was completely controlled by the British. So he decided to swerve and go into British Rhodesia, which was the only British land that was invaded from any military power during the whole First World War. But then, November 11th, 1918 happened, and the guns fell silent, and yeah, you know the rest. The First World War ended. However, news didn't reach von Lettow until the 16th of November, and he was about to make an attack on the British Rhodesians when he received news that the war was over. And on the 25th of November, he officially surrendered to Brigadier General William Frederick Edwards at Abercorn, and he tried to give his officer's sword to Edwards, but Edwards refused. I guess it's like when you make the cops chase you, and then when they finally catch your ass, they fuck you up. That's probably how Edwards was feeling. When von Lettow got the details about the armistice, he didn't cry like a little bitch like Hitler, but he was furious about the relinquishment of all the German territories. Schnee refused to sign the papers giving German East Africa over to Britain, but in the end that didn't matter. It was still going to be a British territory regardless of the feelings of the Germans. Most of the partition of German East Africa would go to Britain, but Belgium, Portugal, and France would all get a slice of the action, whilst the Germans were forced to take the blame for the entire First World War. As for the main character of this story, I guess I'll literally take a page out of Byron Farwell's book, The Great War in Africa. He puts it better than I could, and also, I'm at the end of this script, and I really want to finish this, so I'm gonna cheat a little. Fuck you if you have a problem with it. Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck was indeed a brilliant soldier, who invoked universal admiration. For men admire bravery, endurance, persistence, courtesy in adversity, and dignity in defeat. And these were the qualities which he exemplified. He succeeded in what he set out to do, yet what he did was in the end worse than useless, for he could not prevent the victory of his country's enemies. He cost the lives of thousands and the health of tens of thousands more. He tore the social fabric of hundreds of communities and wrecked the economy of 3 countries. His splendid military virtues were devoted to an unworthy cause, and his loyalty given to a bad monarch. After the war, von Lettow would put down a communist uprising back home, and then he would ironically take part in a coup d'etat to overthrow the Weimar Republic, which was the successor to the German Empire after 1918. His buddy Schnee would then cozy up to the Nazis, but von Lettow told Hitler to go fuck himself when he was asked to join the party. He married Martha Wallrath in 1919, and she gave him 4 children, 2 daughters and 2 sons, that would die in World War II fighting for the German army, and he would die on the 9th of March 1964 at age 93, outliving his wife, who died in 1953. 2 Askaris, now old veterans, showed up to his funeral, and he was buried in Pronsdorf, Schleswig-Holstein, in the graveyard of Weisslin Church. The Bundestag voted to pay off von Lettow's Askari, and many former Askari showed up with tattered uniforms and badges to prove they were von Lettow's men. But this wasn't enough, so they were given brooms to perform the manual of arms, and all the men never forgot the actions or words of their coat of arms. And then the German government fucking shot them all and missed 629 fucking times. Just kidding, they were all paid.